Hello and welcome back to another update from the Russo-Ukrainian War. It's your host Weeb Union and I'm back with the recent developments across the front line. We start out here to the west of Avdiivka, where the Russians have managed to advance and capture the final parts of the Ukrainian fortifications north of Nitailove. With this, the Russians are now closer to moving and attacking the village of Nitailove, and the Russians have also managed to advance here in the northern part towards Umansk, capturing the forest line to the south of the village. With this, the Russians are developing their offensive operations west of Tonenke in two directions, both towards Nitailove in the south and towards Umansk in the north. Taking a closer look at the fortifications in the area, we see that there are a few across the road between Umansk and Nitailove. It is likely that the Russians, with these attempts and offensive operations in the north and south, to isolate all of these three villages from each other. Cutting off the road here to the south by Nitailove would cut off Nitailove from Yasnobrodivka and Umansk to the north, and cutting off the road south of Umansk would cut off Umansk from Yasnobrodivka. There is still this crossing across the river line here to the north of Yasnobrodivka, which will allow a connection between Umansk and Yasnobrodivka. But if the Russians manage to capture the fortifications here by the road and the southern parts of Umansk, then they will also have fire control over this road between the two villages. At the same time, with their locations here in the east of Nitailove, north of Pervomaisk, the Russians are within close enough range to launch artillery strikes on the only crossing across the lakes here to the west of Yasnobrodivka. This area here is fairly shallow. This means that any Ukrainian attempt at resupplying through it would be heavily bombarded by Russian artillery. With this, we see that there would be very limited supply to these three villages, and the coordination between them would be difficult due to the Russians cutting off the direct connection between the three of them, and the Russians will likely develop their offensive operations in this direction by focusing on one of them at a time. Or if they have enough troops, they can attack all three at the same time and avoid the Ukrainians from concentrating their troops at one place and dealing with the Russians one at a time, simply by preventing the Ukrainians from relocating their troops from one village to another by cutting off the connection between them. Moving in a southern direction from this, we see here in the direction of Novomykhailivka this geolocated footage confirming Ukrainian presence within the fortifications here to the south of Novomykhailivka. This means that the fighting over these fortifications are ongoing, and until the Russians gain control of them, the Ukrainians will still have a presence within Novomykhailivka, and the Russians will not be able to take control of the town, as the Russians will need full control over these fortifications to the south to push the Ukrainians out, as the Ukrainians would then have no fortified positions to fall back to, and the area within the town itself would be very limited, meaning that the Ukrainians would have a very difficult time to hold on to their positions. Any Russian offensive would prove to be successful at that point. Moving back north in the direction of the northern parts of Avdiivka, the Russians have made a significant advance here in the northern parts by the railways. The Russians managed to capture the fortifications to the northeastern parts, and following that, they launched an attack into the Dacia area in the central parts. With this geolocated footage, we see that the Russians have confirmed to reach and get a foothold within the Dacia area. If the Russians manage to gain control over this area right here, then they can start launching attacks towards the fortifications to the west of the railways. Gaining control of that as well will allow them to secure their flank here by the north of Berdishi, which then can allow the Russians to begin offensive operations towards Novomykhailivka, Solovyove, and Ocheretyne here to the north. At the same time, the fighting continues by Novomykhailivka with only small positional fighting. There's no significant progress by either side, but the fighting is intense. With the intense fighting taking place here in all of these directions, we see that the Russians are currently looking to gain control over Novomykhailivka and Keramik to the east, Novomykhailivka and Solovyo here to the south of Ocheretyne, before moving through the railways directly towards Ocheretyne and launching an offensive towards that. With the capture of Berdishi, the Russians are now able to relocate their forces and spread them across the northern flank, allowing them to now attack multiple directions, such as the railways and Novomykhailivka to the northeast, and likely going to develop the situation here to the north of Berdishi, fighting over all of these fortifications located in the area. We then move further north in the direction of Bakhmut, here to the west of Bakhmut, east of Chasiv Yar. We see that the Russians have made two advancements, both in the northern and southern flanks of Chasiv Yar. In the southern flank west of Bohdanivka, the Russians have managed to push through and gain a foothold in the fortifications here to the east of the canal, and with this the final fortifications over the east of canal are being contested. The way this works, as someone asked me, sometimes the Russians capture half a trench and it stays like that for a week or so before the Russians gain full control of it. How does this work? It works in the way that the Russians gain a foothold within the trench and then push through it. Then the Ukrainians launch counterattacks to try and recapture the positions and avoid the loss of them, to send additional units to that area, and the Russians continue doing the same. So there ends up being a direct fight between the two sides over the trenches, in the location of the trenches, not necessarily within them. And this is why it sometimes takes a while, because there's a bit of back and forth. The Russians may lose a foothold and then gain back to it the next day, and this is why the front line doesn't really change on the map, although heavy fighting takes place and there's a lot of back and forth, which causes hundreds of casualties over a single trench in the area east of the canal, for example. And other times, like in the case of the forest line here to the northeast of the area we just talked about, the Russians simply capture the trenches and fortifications in one fell swoop, gaining full control of it and then advancing further towards the forest patch. With this geolocated footage, we see that the Russians did capture this area, and it is just delayed information. We already reported on the capture of it, but now we see the geolocated footage confirming it. And with this footage, we see that the Russians sometimes gain full control over fortifications and then move on. Other times they have to fight over them for multiple days due to the Ukrainian response and counterattacks. This is likely happening when the trenches are wider and bigger, such as in the area right here and in the area north of Chasiv. There may or may not be a Ukrainian presence within the outskirts of the trenches. Some days there are, some days there aren't. As such, the fortifications are simply split in two due to the fact that the Ukrainians do not have an active presence within it, but they multiple times launch attacks, leaving it in the gray zone. As for the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Bohdanivka, leaving just a small part in the gray zone, as the Russians have not gained a foothold within the forest patch yet. And with this, the village of Bohdanivka is in Russian hands a year after the Wagner forces first managed to gain control or a foothold of a part of Bohdanivka. After that, the Ukrainians launched their counterattack, pushing the Russians completely away from it, and now the Russians a year later have full control over Bohdanivka, and the Battle of Kalinina will start. We also got some geolocated footage showing that the Russians have now reached the Dacha area of the northeastern outskirts of Chasiv Yar, and with this the Russians have full control over the forest patch here by the railways. It's likely that the Russians will continue advancing along the railways and try to gain full control over the Dacha area. It is much easier for them to gain control over that than the industrial and residential area of Chasiv Yar, as there are larger buildings and heavy areas that are difficult to break through. All of these recent advancements add up to this recent report by Syrsky. Ukraine's top commander says Eastern Front Line has significantly worsened. In this article, multiple parts are being covered. First one is that Chasiv Yar is the main focus of attack of the Russians right now. Their efforts are to take control over the city ahead of their summer offensive, as gaining control over the city will allow the Russians to have fire control over the nearby cities of Konstantinivka, Rushkova, and Kramatorsk. At the same time, Ukrainian analysts claim that Russian troops have reached the canal separating the eastern and western regions of Chasiv Yar. This is likely the area here to the west of Ivanivsk, where the Russians likely have full control over the trenches by now, as they've pushed through. This will allow them to start pushing towards gaining a foothold across and fighting over the fortifications here by the crossing between the two forest patches. Gaining fire control over the cities here to the west of Chasiv Yar of Konstantinivka, Turushka, and Kramatorsk will allow the Russians to significantly develop the offensive operations in the summer offensive by heavily bombarding all of the fortifications all around the area, as Chasiv Yar is located in the highest ground in the whole area, allowing them to gain this fire control and operational advantage when it comes to the section of the front line. And that is all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.